So the name Ibis came from me wanting to name the company not after myself, but after a bird, because birds are light and they fly, and I just like that connotation. Names I considered were Merlin, but since that Merlin was taken by the Bob Jackson Company, I didn't take that one. Kestrel is another one I considered. There wasn't a Kestrel at the time. And as we know, both Merlin and Kestrel became famous companies in the bike industry after that. And those are bird, you know, Merlin is a bird as well, in addition to a magician. But he's, you know, I think they're named, if you look at the logo, it's a bird.
He's smarter than he looks. And you just know that when he's like looking at something, I'll ask him some simple question, and I just get this kind of long professorial type answer. I'm like, whoa.
The stem, he had the first, limp dick stem, for the road handlebars, so he could, use wide road handlebars on mountain bikes. Great marketer, did a fantastic job with all the different ads in Velo News way back when, really got people interested in mountain bikes.
From the day I met him, I've been inspired by Scott. I've been motivated by him. I love his bicycles. I love the guy.
Hi, I'm Scot Nicol, and I am from Santa Rosa, California. I'm the founder of IBIS Cycles. When I was a kid, I had a paper route, and I saw this balloon tire bicycle inside my neighbor's garage. I noticed that my mom was never riding her bike, and I took it down to the neighbor's house and I said, "You don't have a bike for your wife, do you? How'd you like to trade this?" So he said yes. Basically, I got this bike by stealing my mom's bike from her. So that was back in about 1965 or so. By the way, I paid my mom back. I built her a custom Ibis. I found a stash of old steel cruiser frames, Xuans, some Excelsiors, things like that. I gradually converted them one at a time. This is just one of those bikes. It's got some great period piece parts on it that just preserved in time beautifully. The TA cranks, the Brooks saddle, the Mayfac center pulls. There's these mbira high-rise bars with the cross piece that I think are worth about $1 billion on eBay right now, if you can find them. And the old Suntour thumb shifters, mbira motorcycle levers. These rims are 2.125 wide. Mariah 7X, kind of cool. We actually have video footage from an old 8mm movie camera of the first ride I ever took on a bike. It was kind of love at first pedal stroke. Growing up, my dad was a tinkerer, and I was always in the shop with him. I just sort of learned from him, even if you don't have any professional training in something, go ahead and try it. I learned how to braze some cantilever brakes on there, and then just put some gears on it. And that was the precursor to wanting to build my own bike from scratch. I called up what was then Mountain Bikes, which is the Charlie, Kelly, and Gary Fisher's business that they had just started in Fairfax selling Tom Ritchie made frames. And those guys said, "Come on down, let's go to Crested Butte together." So I met all those guys, met Joe Breeze, he was over there too. That year I was on a Cook Brothers Cruiser, a nicer frame, chromoly frame that I had converted to gears. And that's what I rode over Pearl Pass that year. I drove out to Crested Butte with Charlie and got a nice 24-hour dose of Charlie's wisdom. Joe was in Mill Valley and Charlie was in Fairfax, so I was commuting over Mount Tam on my bike, going back to see each of those guys. And I actually lived with Steve Potts, and that was before Steve was building frames. He was still a sheet metal worker back in the day. I wanted to do some projects with Charlie, and so we actually started fabricating the roller cam brakes together. I was the guy with the car and the guy who would run over to find bushings and raw aluminum and things like that. Charlie preferred to ride his bike and not really get in the car very often. Charlie was the guy who figured out the Type 2 fork, and so a lot of the early bikes that I was building, if somebody wanted that, I would put those forks on there. Charlie's a very innovative guy, and although Joe was the first guy to step out and build a purpose-built mountain bike from scratch, he was in a way a traditionalist, using traditional frame building techniques. Phillip Braze, because you couldn't get any lugs back then. Very innovative guy. I'm not saying that in a bad way, just that was Joe's way of doing things. Whereas Charlie, he would look at something that worked perfectly well and he would deconstruct it and reassemble it in a way that he thought was better. So everything Charlie looked at, he wanted to change and improve. That next spring, I started building my own. And I built one frame for myself, and somebody asked me if I would build them a frame, and I said yes. And fast forward, here we are, 36 6 years later. I kind of hybridized between what Joe had done with a very slack, more closer to what the Excelsiors and Schwinns were, and then Charlie went more modern geometry in his bikes, more upright, and so I sort of met in the middle there. I apprenticed with those guys, and then I hung up my own shingle on April 1st of 1981 and started building Ibis frames up in Mendocino, California. April Fool's Day, appropriate. As part of my deal with Joe, I got a bike out of working with him over the winter, so I own Breezer number 13. I had that bike, and then I had ridden Charlie's bikes and had my experience with my Schwinns and Excelsiors and things like that. I just took the sort of the top tube links and chain stays and things like that. Pretty soon the geometry got to be where I liked it, and I kept it there. I didn't live on Mount Tam. I didn't live in Marin, so there wasn't a big downhill focus. The pink 1982 bike with the little confetti paint job, yeah, pink was a big color then. That's a good period piece. That one's all original. It was very representative of what our questionable tastes in color and fashion in the 80s. I started all the first bikes were all Phillip Braze, and that one was TIG welded, and it's got the Speedmaster brakes that Charlie and I made, and the high-E hubs that Charlie showed me how to modify, and we kept doing those to make the bearings accessible, things like that, widen the hub flanges for better spoke bracing angle. The mountain trials with a 24-inch rear wheel, 26-inch front wheel was a fun experiment that came after this big popularity of trials, and trials was really, really big back then. Everybody was doing it. It was pretty funny. And then guys like Kevin Norton and Andy Grayson came in and got so good that I think it became really intimidating. And I think that's what happened in trials, is people got so good that its popularity sort of waned. We did continue building this bike we called the Mountain Trials, and it was a bike that was meant to still allow us to do some of these fun trials moves, but also go out on a bike ride. It was a very fun kind of riding we were doing back then that involved a lot of finding obstacles and jumping over them and just, going off the beaten path whenever we felt like it. So in 1988, I decided to try to build some carbon fiber bikes. So I contacted some aerospace carbon guys. So I gave them 3 parameters, I think: stiffness and strength, and then weight. Carbon is anisotropic. You can make it stiff in one direction and flexible in the other direction. So we played around with building bikes that had nice torsional rigidity but a little bit of softness vertically. We built 4 of those bikes. The lugs were made out of steel. They were welded lugs that I had turned on a big lathe, made them really nice, long, tapered, and then we actually glued the tubes together, the 3 carbon main tubes, and we headed in the titanium direction instead of heading in the carbon direction at that point. The Bronstein bike was one of those 4 bikes that I had built. I think I chromed lugs on a couple of them and then glued it together. So it was a really pretty bike. And on those first 4 carbon bikes, we actually put a little diamond in the eyeball of the Ibis bird in the head badge. I don't know where any of those head badges are anymore. They all disappeared. And finally, we hung it up as a museum piece on the wall and moved on to titanium bikes and spent a lot of time and effort on a bike, and eventually it's going to be a little bit outdated, and that's why you have a museum. You can look at your past bikes and your past triumphs and failures. The Mojo was introduced in 1992. When I see one of those, I feel very proud. I said, that's a really well executed bike, and it's timeless. It's one of those that's not an embarrassment when it's on the wall. There are those that are like, oh, what were we thinking when we did that? In 2000, I sold Ibis to a group of investors from outside the industry. The first Ibis was a 20-year-long stint, and then these guys took it for 20 months and declared full-on scorched earth Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I had left the company, and Hans, one of my current partners in Ibis, he was half of Santa Cruz Bicycles, basically, and he was leaving Santa Cruz, and so he called me right when the bankruptcy was announced and wanted to know the details of the deal. And I was pretty bitter on the whole thing, but he persisted, and we engineered a way to get the assets of Ibis out of bankruptcy. And then Hans started working on the next IBIS. What Hans wanted to do is he wanted to flip that paradigm of having form follows function and instead design the frame first, make it very beautiful, and then prove the design. Another thing that Hans did was he hired a designer with zero experience in designing bicycle frames because we wanted to bring a whole new fresh look into how these bikes looked. And so Hans had made an acquaintance with Roxy Lowe, who's still with the company and still designs all of our frames. And Roxy didn't know bikes, and that's exactly what Hans wanted. Dave Weigel gave us two-dimensional drawing with a bunch of dots on it. We told him the geometry we wanted, and we told him how it wanted to ride, and then he told us where the suspension points needed to be. Roxy basically started sketching, connecting the dots, and then we brought in another design company to bring it into 3 dimensions. That's when all this CAD work, this 2,000 hours of CAD time came in to create this first Mojo frame, which was it's a remarkable frame, and it really was the talk of the Interbike trade show in 2005. When we introduced it, it was a spectacular bike, and we gambled the company on it. We had one product. Soon after that, we hired Brian Lopes to race for us, and you'd get pictures of him doing 40 or 50 foot gaps on his Mojo, and it's like, oh well, I guess those things are all right. So that helped a lot, I think, to have a real good pro riding one of our bikes. We've never tried to be the world dominating company, and I think that's one of the things that helps us. We don't have any outside investors. The people who own the company are all working it every day, and again, we don't really want to be the big world dominating company. We want to build really good bikes and hopefully enjoy ourselves while we're doing it.
He was definitely connected to the very origins of the sport, but he did a lot of things to evolve IBIS from being just a kind of one-man custom builder shop to being a real company.
Scot's a great guy. He's a hard worker, and he sees a really good big picture. He naturally progressed as a bike builder, moving to the next step. We call him Chuck.
He lives a life of Riley. His alter ego, Chuck Ibis, is a guy that we make fun of, and I always say, fuck Chuck, because that guy is always, like, you'll see him, he's like, oh, I'm off in Moab, I'm off in Paris, I'm off in Tokyo, I'm in Italy, it's like, I'm like.
One time I asked Scott, what's new? And he said, quality vacations. And that's when I recognized the true genius of Scot Nicol.
Just a great guy and a great personality and a great ambassador for cycling.
If you look at Gary Fisher bicycles, Gary Klein bicycles, Greg LeMond bicycles, Keith Bontrager bicycles, all of those guys were acquired by Trek. So by not naming the bike company after me, I think I avoided an acquisition by Trek, which I'm happy about. That's a joke.
I mean, he rides his bicycle all around the world, all year round. Never want to get caught up in the fashion about nothing, and he's just another solid bike dude.
When you get on a bike and you pedal away from home or your parents or whatever, you get that taste of freedom that is probably one of the first times in your life you really get it. And I think that's where a lot of the passion and love for cycling comes, is that it's just all about freedom. Yeah, I was a competitive cyclist for a while. When I first started IBIS, I raced in a bunch of races and won a few. I was in the first Norba Nationals in 1983 in Santa Barbara, the one that Steve Tilford won, rest in peace. I got 6th place in that one. In the 1983 Norba Nationals, I rode IBIS number 7 that I had built, and it was a steel hardtail, Phillip brazed, no suspension whatsoever. It was the bike of the moment. That's what we all rode back then.